26th, and this is the Jewish community Shabbaton Poughkeepsie. Our weekend theme is Judaism and the Mysteries of Life, Death, and the World Beyond. And this presentation is on Jacob's legacy, end-of-life wisdom for our time. So what I want to do is raise the question this way. What can we learn from our biblical ancestors in caring for the needs of the dying and bereaved in our time? And last night I talked about life after death and some of the implications for the grief journey. I wrote a little book that I actually like. It's one of my favorite, if I kind of have a favorite, Living and Dying in Ancient Times, Death, Burial, and Mourning in Biblical Tradition, in which I look at different themes of the Tanakh with regard to dying and death. So some of what I'm talking about here today comes from that piece. But so in a little bit, we're going to rewind the Torah back to Parshat Vayechi. Vayechi is the last chapter of Genesis, where we read about Jacob's death and about Joseph's death. And we need to do a rewind because that parsha usually falls sometime around New Year's between what they call Christmas and New Year's, and so people are usually in Florida, so you missed that. So that's why you have to do the sort of spring reruns from the winter season. But I'm still stuck back where Rabbi Miriam was talking about Vayidom Aaron, and Aaron was silent. And I had this experience this week where it was 2 years late. I bought tickets to her concert for my wife for her birthday, and we went 2 years later. I was actually in a large public venue for the first time in 2 years. It was it was a Celtic group of women singing, and they sang Danny Boy. Danny Boy is actually a World War I grief and war song. And at a certain point, I just thought of all of those mothers from Russia and Ukraine who were losing children in this war. And and then yesterday I heard a story of a family that had twins and one child died. And so I wanted to use that as a jumping point, and I decided just that I wanted to tell you a story as an intro to what we're going to do here this morning. And the story is, wait, it's not that story, it's this story here. The story of the prophet Elijah and a dead child. A woman comes to a prophet Elijah and says, Prophet Elijah, you are such a holy man. She's holding in her arms a dead child with the pain that only a mother who has buried a child could ever understand. And she says, Prophet Elijah, could you bring my child back to life? And he says, I will, if you can bring me a loaf of bread from a home in which there have never been shed tears of grief. So the woman goes to the first home and knocks on the door and says, could you have a loaf of bread? And he says, yeah, sure, we have a loaf of bread. Have ever there been shed in this home tears of grief? And they say, come on in, let us tell you a story. So again, they tell her their story and she tells them her story, and she leaves and goes somewhere else and says, do you have a loaf of bread? Sure, we have a loaf of bread. Have ever there been shed tears in this home? Well, as a matter of fact, come on in. And again, they exchange stories, and she tells her story, and they tell her their story of their grief. And she goes to another house and to another house and to another house, and comes back to Prophet Elijah and says, I don't have a loaf of bread for you, but thank you for giving me the gift of my humanity, because in connecting with all of these other human beings, I have not been so isolated in my time of loss. And so I wanted, in a way, that it was the parsha of Vayidom Aaron that reminded me of that. He was silent because he was a bereaved parent. He had nothing to say. He was still in shock. But to draw back and look at it, how can we use this? Grief is built into the human operating system. I don't know. It seems to be a flaw in the design, but every human being who's ever lived dies. I mean, I don't want to be a downer. I want to, I want to be able to laugh with you about life, but that seems to be part of what's going on. So that's one thing we want to take out of that story. But the other thing is we are living in a time of total transformation of attitudes towards dying and death. What Sigmund Freud wrote on the interpretation of dreams in 1900, and that began the new century, and that began the transformation of attitudes towards human sexuality. And it's 122 years later, and we still got a long way to go, but we've made some strides. In 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross writes on death and dying, and that begins the transformation of human attitudes towards death and dying. And between more Chevra Kadisha and Hospice and green burial, and they're giving people psychedelics now on the deathbed, sign on to be in an experiment, right? All of this, the world is changing more than we realize with regard to dying and death. And so the question that we're asking here is, what does Torah have to say that can feed that conversation? And what does Judaism have to say in particular that can help us? Because Judaism is a very, very good system. If death is built into the operating system of the human condition, Judaism has a good software program. So now we're going to go study Torah a little bit, and we'll begin the conversation. And I'm going to engage you in conversation. I'm going to ask Rabbi Mike to be my reader for the first text. Okay, so we're in Vayechi. Rabbi Michael, please. You there?
He was having some technology issues.
Okay,
I'll
Miriam.
read, Simcha.
Miriam.
Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147.
Okay, so let's at least put it in time. 147 is because he took his vitamins and he worked out every day. Okay, so that's the first thing. He lived a long time because he took good care of himself. Remember, Joseph gets thrown into a pit. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up being president of pyramids.com. He invites his father, Joseph, and Jacob comes there. 147 years. He was the guy who wrestled with the angel. He had 4 wives. His son was thrown into a pit. His daughter Dinah was raped. I don't know if they taught you that in Hebrew school. We figured he learned something in his life, that he had acquired a certain amount of wisdom. We could critique him, and he had problems. He needed therapy, but he had come a long way. And here's how this story begins. Vakasha, please read, Rabbi Miriam. Read this one. Whoops, no, go back. Okay, go.
When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, promise me that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff.
Okay, so the first question I want to ask you, and I don't know if people can unmute themselves, but I got, is what's Jacob's attitude towards his own death? And how does his own death compare with death attitudes in our culture? Let's just stop for a minute. And he says, "Behold, I'm about to die," and he gives his final wishes. How does that compare with attitudes towards death in our own culture? We're a small enough group, so unmute yourself and pipe in. Yeah.
He seems very matter-of-fact about it.
Right, he's not making such a big deal of it. He's not like, I want to talk about it, right? How's it? Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Joey.
Joey.
He's accepting. He accepts the fact that he's about to die. And as has just been said, he's not fighting it. He's calm about it. And he's also giving practical instructions to his son to guide him as to what to do after Jacob dies.
Well, we hear these stories where the wife knows the husband's going to die, the husband knows that he's going to die, the kids know, but nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. And part of what it is we live in this culture, and I think it's even more problematic these days. Sort of COVID has not helped. We carry this fear. And look, what are all the euphemisms we use around death, right? People don't die. They passed away, they pass on, they expired. I had to check my driver's license this morning to see whether I had expired or not. They went to and they met his fate, his number came up, kicked the bucket. Oh, let me talk about kick the 6 feet under. We have all these nice things. What about the phrase kick the bucket? Anybody want to comment on that one? It is used a lot in our culture. We have all these euphemisms around death.
And now we have bucket list.
Now we have a bucket list. Well, if you read the Shulchan Aruch, if you read the Code of Jewish Law, which is state-of-the-art death and dying practices, state-of-the-art for the 1600s anyways, it says immediately after death, you pour out the standing water. Okay, now there's a midrash of how just to drink. The angel of death washes his sword in the water. So, they didn't know bacterial science and infection, and they didn't have Kohler plumbing probably. So they would pour out the standing water. Now, imagine we lived in a small little town square, and you'd go out in the morning and you'd see everybody's door in front. And it happened that old man Moshe in the middle of the night died, and they poured out the water. And you opened the door and you looked across the way and you saw old man Moshe's house, and they had poured out the water, and you thought to yourself, he kicked the bucket. And that's the origin of that term, kick the bucket. It goes back to, right? So we have this whole other legacy where we had this fantastic discomfort around dying and death. So let's I'm going to go back into a text. Anyone want to comment on just sort of death denial in our culture?
Hi, I just wanted to say that there's a big difference between dying and death. And with modern technology and advances and everything, we have this oftentimes a huge dying process as opposed to kicking the bucket.
Well, part of the problem that we're dealing with is that the medicalization of death in many ways has made it much more complex. There was a time when people died in their home and people could be present, and now there's all, the ICU or the highway is where a lot of people die. Though actually 40% of Americans are dying in hospice, but unfortunately most of them only get there within the last 48 hours. So while there's changes, we got a long way to go. And if you haven't yet read Atul Gawande's book, I'm trying to remember his name right now, Being Mortal. He talks exactly about this. In cities where there are larger medical facilities, the quality of death is worse because there's so many. You keep trying. So here's the other thing that I want to extract from this story. Rabbi Miriam, you want to read this? Okay, so Jacob dies, he accepts his own death. Then his son Joseph, in the same parsha, he's about to die, and says the following.
Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay, so what I want to extract from here is Joseph's acceptance of his own death. He learned his attitude toward death from his father. His father was open to his own death. And when the time came, he was open to it also. He said to his brothers, I'm about to die. So we really learn our attitudes towards death in our family of origin. What was your family of origin style? Were they depressed, grieved parents? Were they angry? Were they the monsters? Was it a biracial family, an interfaith family? Actually, let me just throw this in here. Think about it for a minute. What was your earliest memory of an encounter with death? And how did the people around you respond? What were you taught? And is what you were taught what you want to affirm, or do you have to unlearn that? I think that I asked the question. I'm going to go first. My mother, I said this last night, my mother was 10 years old when her father was killed in a car accident. And as I grew up, I remember my mother saying Yisker all the time. And she spoke about him. She spoke, it was kind of bittersweet. It wasn't morbid. She remembered her father. She talked about what it was like as growing up as a young girl after the father died, and her mother, how her mother dealt with it. And my grandmother was 33 in 1933. She was a widow long before widow-to-widow support groups and single moms. She was an Eastern European immigrant who had 3 kids. My mother was 10, was the oldest of them. But I learned an ethic towards dying and death that we could talk about it. And here I am talking to people about dying and death 50, 60 years later. So I'm wondering, Jacob taught Joseph, and what do we learn? So how did anybody want to comment what you learned? How was death talked about in your family of origin? Please, Adrian.
When I was 4, my uncle died at the age of 39, and I sat with my grandmother, and she was weeping, of course, and she said, a mother should never lose a child. And, which was true. And I went through the whole grieving process with her. And then 5 years later, my mother's best friend's husband died, and I was 9. And we would go and every night during Shiva. And I said to my mother, what am I supposed to do? She said, you talk to Effie about Joe, because you're keeping his spirit alive. And I have done that from that day on.
What a rare story, because kids were not taken to Shiva. Kids were not taken to funerals in those years. I mean, it's a little different now, but that story is not normative. That story is much more, it's heroic what your family did. Someone, thank you. Anyone else? Who had a family where, Miriam,
Well, a couple of things. When I was 6, I knew my great-grandfather, but when I was 6 years old, he died, and my parents took me and my little sister to the funeral. And oh my goodness, was that a scandal, let me tell you.
Right, it was a scandal to take a kid to a funeral, that's right.
And when my father was ill, and he was terminally ill, my mother told us that he was probably going to die. And my father's family were of the ilk that you don't talk about it. They didn't even want him to know that he might die.
Right.
So well, I saw conflict in my family about how to approach that.
Did that inspire you to become a rabbi? I mean, these kind of things. Anybody else? Thank you. Let's one more story. Anybody have family where nobody talked about it? Yeah, please, Stephen.
Well, I was very fortunate in that my one grandfather died at 85. I didn't lose anybody till I was 50, which was unheard of,
Well, though that's not that uncommon anymore.
Well, so like Grandma Rashevsky died at 101 3/4, and so, and bringing up the subject, something unusual happened. I was a birth coach for a couple that I know, and their child died within 24 hours of being born. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my grandmother says, well, you know, your great Aunt Rena, she had a child. And remember, and then my mother says, well, you know, and it was every woman in my family, when I came to them with this horrific story that I had witnessed, there were all these children that I did not realize in my childhood had passed. So nobody talked about nothing until I needed it desperately. And then suddenly the stories came out of the woodwork.
There's a book, I think the title is called The Girl in the Picture, or it's called The Picture on the Wall. It's a memoir of someone who grew up not knowing that her older sister had died. And so, you know, a lot of people grow up with a sort of an invisible ghost in the family when there's death of a child. And yeah, I mean, you know, that's changing slowly. Look, we don't even have a traditional style for helping somebody if you have a stillborn, you know, and didn't live past 30 days. If you have an infant death, in Judaism, traditionally, you don't even say Kaddish. You don't even do a funeral. Though that's
I can just say passed away. I am almost incapable of saying someone died. To this day, I have to say they passed away.
Okay, so let me say something. When someone dies, you know, first of all, if you go up and you say to somebody, you know, shake down, I'm so sorry, call me if you need me. I want you to change that. I want you to say it like this. Hey, buddy, kiss your ass goodbye, because you ain't going to hear from me. Okay? Because that's when you say, call me if you need me. The nature of the beast is people don't reach out. So if you say, I'll be in touch, and you call. One of my friends, her husband died suddenly, and she had to raise 2 children. And and she worked as a therapist. I knew she worked nights. I would call at 11 o'clock, and she never picked up the phone, but I left her a message. So I'm thinking of you. How you doing? I'm thinking of you. How you doing? Months later, she said, it really meant a lot to me that you called, because I was so disorganized and so chaotic. I didn't even know how I couldn't even return any phone messages. So, you know, that's certainly one thing to do. And what I'll say to somebody is, what was the circumstances of their death? It's okay to use the D word, by the way. It's okay. You think, oh, I don't want to upset them. They just buried somebody. How are you going to set them by you know? I'm sorry he passed away. We want to put the D word back into our vocabulary. Okay, one more.
I just wanted to add on to that. When my father did die, nobody talked to us. Like, we'd go to school, we'd go to the synagogue, and nobody would talk about it.
So let's see, where do I have it? I have it. I think I put it right here. Okay, we're going to pause for commercial now. This is another little book I wrote, May the Angels Carry You, Jewish Prayers and Meditations for the Deathbed. And my friend Nadia Gross, who's a rabbi in Boulder, wrote the foreword to it. And she talked about how her father was a community leader, and he was, you know, very affable guy, and he died suddenly. And again, there was no communal support, because people didn't know what to say. And so part of why Rabbi Mike reached out to me knows I do this stuff, and your rabbis, it's like you need a refresher on how to deal with this stuff without being so freaked out about it. You know, we do have really, really good Jewish death traditions, but we have been Americanized and hence Protestantized in our Jewish death practices. I'm going to say this and then I'm going to move on, because I know they're going to cut me out when the time is up. But I'm a Canadian on a green card. I haven't yet gotten my citizenship, because I tried a barbecue on the 4th of July and I flunked. So I have to be careful what I say. But you know, we're pickled in the brine of New England Protestantism. The Puritans were the Taliban of Protestant England. Okay, we've idealized them. You know, the kids learn about Thanksgiving and, you know, their cute shoes and their hats. They were religious fundamentalists who got kicked out of England, and they didn't like Christmas. They didn't like Easter. They weren't wild about the women. I think they burnt them as witches. They couldn't have been now wild about the Jews, and they were very uncomfortable with messy emotions. And so we, as Jews in this country, have sort of been assimilated into that kind of Protestant emotional style around dying and death. The Moroccan Jews have wailing women, and you had to in Mishnaic times, a husband had to be able to pay for 3 wailing women and somebody to play a flute at their funerals. So we need to bring music back to funerals. So we have a very strong Jewish tradition, but we've lost touch with it. Okay, let's keep going, and we'll have more to say, okay, about this. So then the next thing we hear from Jacob is the following. Okay, Rabbi Miriam, please.
Jacob said to Joseph, El Shaddai appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me and said to me, I am going to make you fruitful and will increase your numbers, make you a community of peoples, and give you this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants.
And on the bottom right.
As I was returning from Padan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the road to Ephrat, and I buried her there in Ephrat, that is Bethlehem.
Okay, so my question here is, so what's he doing here? What's going on here? Anyone? First of all, he's storytelling. What's his storytelling about? It's not a trick question. He's telling the story. Joanne, did you put Joanne? You put your hand up, or were you waving, or were you going to say something?
His life.
His life. He's doing his life review. He's telling about the good stuff, and he's doing about the bad stuff, and that's what people need to be doing as part of their departure preparation. People need to be able to tell their story. If somebody's dying, you don't know what to say to them. Ask them, what are some of the reflections on your own life journey? That's what, we have this great tradition of Jewish ethical wills. Last night when I talked about afterlife, I talked about the life review. At the end of life, you see your whole life journey, right? But I mentioned this book here. We have a whole tradition of ethical wills. And these are the things that people need to talk about. What were the highlights of your life growing up as a child, as a teenager? I have that in here. In your adult life, your middle years, are there specific memories you want to talk about? Who are the important influences on your life? Do you have any regrets you want to talk about? If you haven't yet written an ethical will, do that. Or I say to my students, my university students, when you go home for Thanksgiving, put your grandparents in front of your iPhone and let them tell their story. You have grandchildren, tell them, you know what, I want to tell you some pieces of my story. That's really, really, really important. It's important for you. It's important for your descendants to be able to have that. I have 8 hours. I interviewed both of my parents, and I set up the camera in a way that I wasn't holding the camera. You could see me and my father, and at one point my son walks in the room. I have to go into that video. I turned it from VHS. Now I turned it into DVD, but I want to go in and take out a picture, because there's a frame there where there's me and my father and my son in that same picture. But I have that. My father knew every detail. I'd ask my mother, she'd say, I don't remember that. Go ask Daddy. But what we see Jacob teaches us is that it's important in preparing for the end of life journey. And you want to do it while you're alive and well, because I can see a few of you live too long to die young. Looking at my Hollywood squares, I have to say that for a lot of these faces, you live too long to die young. That's the good news. So there's still plenty of time. Anyone comments?
Yeah, we have a certain impatience with old people in general. and especially their tendency to perseverate and keep talking about the good old days. And actually, in its own way, that's a form of the kind of preparation you're talking about. It doesn't only happen when you're close to death. It happens at a certain stage in your life when aspects of your life become very vivid for you. And we tend to want them not to share those with us. Enough of this already, Grandpa.
Well, you know, there's a lot of stuff come out about Jewish ethical wills. Ethical, like Jacob's deathbed story is almost like an ethical will. You sort of you clear your throat and then you say what you have to say. And you know, in that same parsha, he blesses his children. He chews some of them out. He gives his burial wishes that we're gonna see in a minute. And so, if you haven't had a chance to write your ethical will, my friend Rabbi David Levin teaches classes on ethical wills, and he has a company. He does video ethical wills for people. People don't have the patience to write it out, but he goes in and he films people, and then he prepares a 1-hour video for someone. Erwin Goldberg raised his hand. Where are you?
Hey, Rabbi.
Go. Yeah.
When my father was dying from cancer, he called us he called the whole family to his hospital room to gather on a particular weekend. And there were so many things that I didn't know about. My mom died when I was very young. I didn't know any of my great grandparents or a lot of family type stuff. And so I asked him if it would be okay if I talked to him about these things, and he was very willing. He didn't want to be on camera. He said an audio. So I said okay, and I asked him about his family and my mom and my brother, and it was the first time. And the conversation that you related last night, where you were talking about the father and son exchanging these
my Kaddish rap.
Yeah. And we had that dialogue because I literally said to him, how come you never said anything to Steve or I about how, and he said, how could you not think I wasn't proud of you and I didn't love you? He said, I did all of these things that you are basically accusing me of, for lack of a better word, because I loved you. And it was, for me, a very good experience. And I have those recordings and I've shared them with my brother and with my cousins who also didn't know a lot about our family history.
Right. What a beautiful legacy. All right, let's jump back into the text. We'll keep the conversation going. Okay. Michael, are you able to read? Give Miriam a break.
Sure. Now that my computer's working again, yeah. Then Jacob gave them these instructions. I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites.
Let me stay on screen for a little bit longer because I realize time is moving. But what he's doing here, he's saying, look, go into my safety deposit box. You'll find the deed that I have for my burial plot. And the question is, what are you doing about that? Have you thought about traditional Chevra Kadisha or a green burial, or cremation is a dirty word for some people, but it's part of the choices that people have to make. You want a Lexus or you want a Cadillac. So all of these questions. Have you signed your living will? Does anybody here not have a living will? Yes. Okay. So in this country, if you don't have a living will, you're in trouble. You need to sign. You need to sign over your proxy, your healthcare proxy. When my mother was dying, the doctor walked in and said to my brother, "Does your mother have a DNR? Do not resuscitate." He said yes, and that was it. They didn't have to see it. That's Canada. In this country, even if you have a DNR, the doctors, because it's such a litigious society, the doctors can overrule it. So it's really important that you let people know where it is, my doctor asked me, now I have all of my medical stuff on one portal, so I got to bring in my 10-page Jewish living will. There, let's see. I think I have it here. Let me go back into the screen share. The conservative movement created a Jewish medical directives for healthcare. If you look up medical directives, Rabbinical Assembly, it's online. There's like a 10-page document. There's halachic ones. There's 5 wishes. There are all different kinds of stuff easily available. If you need a Jewish question, you go to Reb Google. If you need a medical question, you go to Dr. Google. This is a Chevra Kadisha painting in some of European countries in medieval times. They needed a minion for a vidui. I'd be scared if I saw all those guys on my deathbed. I'd die just looking at them. So, comments, questions? How you doing? Yeah, please, Adrian.
You're muted, Adrian.
Oh,
Now?
you're
Am I
fine.
on? I worked
Yeah.
in a hospital in the ICU and CCU and with hospice patients. And I will say, I think you need the advanced directives form, maybe from the hospital. It's a 1-page form, and then you fill it out, you give it to your physician, you give it to your the hospital, so it's on record. Once they have it, it's digitized. And then also for the people who have agreed to be your healthcare proxies and to follow your wishes. That's the important thing. If they don't agree to follow your wishes, vote them off the island and get someone else.
Well, my son has a hard time making decisions. My daughter is like this. So, my wife, I said, let my son take care of my wife. She's sort of like, I don't want to throw this out. She's, me, it's like, okay, I'm ready to go on the next step. So, these are the things we joke about around our house. My poor kids have had to deal with my funeral humor forever and a day. But if you haven't had these conversations with your family, it's important. Miriam, please, and then we'll go back.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about hospice. Often, if I say to somebody, oh, so-and-so is going on hospice, their first reaction is, oh, yeah, oh, no. And I think that what I want to say about hospice is that hospice has so many wonderful services to support the person who's in the process of dying and also the family. And it's really an incredible resource. And I know Reb Simcha said most people don't get there until, the last day or two. But it's really something. We have a wonderful Hudson Valley hospice here in this area, and the people who work for it are amazing. And there's so many different ways to support the person going through the process of dying and also their family. And I would urge people to not wait. But that also requires, facing what's actually going on.
And one of your Reconstructionist colleagues, Rabbi Jamie Serber, is a hospice chaplain in Dutchess County. I don't know whether it's the Hudson Valley Hospice or where it is, but she's in. I think she's in she lives in the New Paltz area. Erwin, you have your hand up, and then I'm going to go back to a text. Or let me ask Mark Cooper. I haven't heard.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Go.
Hello, Rabbi Rupert. I have a question. Are you going to discuss the Jewish attitude now, today, of cremation? Because many of us are having to make that choice.
Well, I would have to get permission to have another hour and a half on my talk, so I won't discuss it. I'll simply say it's a complex issue. There's also a reform community here, and there have been reform responsa allowing cremation. somewhere on my website under articles, I have a piece where I've written something on cremation. I think that issue is an important one to have conversations within your own community and with your own family. That's all I can say at this period of time. Before they pull the plug on me, I want to keep going on. Okay. Okay, Miriam, I guess you're still a reader here.
Okay, I'm happy to read. Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to mummify his father Israel, so the physicians mummified him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for mummification. And the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days.
You know, they didn't say, "Oh, yeah, I have to go back to work on Tuesday. We're going to do a 3-day shiva." They first of all, he did, you know, Joseph was you know, like I said, he was the president of pyramids.com, and you know, he was a macher in Egypt, and so Jacob had a traditional Egyptian burial ritual, 40 days. And then 7 days. And then after that, he does 7 days of mourning when they take him back to the land. So what it says to us is that they didn't rush through their bereavement rituals. So the other thing we can extract from Jacob's deathbed story is that we want to honor the rhythm of mourning, because people rush through mourning as if I pretend it's over, I don't have to deal with it. And then if I don't have to deal with it, it shows up later, 6 months later, as depression or as anxiety or as an inability to work or insomnia and that. So that what we learn is that if we attend to mourning, then people do a lot better in the long run. Okay, let's do this and then.
Okay, Reb Simcha Mark had his hand up.
Yeah,
Okay.
I've been trying to make a point. Because I've been wrestling a little bit in my head about some of the things you're saying here, and I'll use my parents very quickly as an example. My parents were both Holocaust survivors, and my father wanted to talk about his life forever. He wanted to be filmed, but my mother didn't want to talk about anything. And she wanted to be quiet, and even to the day they both died, it was that way. And I don't understand how you add individuality to what you're saying, because if someone doesn't want to use the word die, who am I to tell them to use the word die? You know, I mean, I don't want to impose something upon someone else. I want to respect who they are. And if my mother, you know, had hurtful feelings about a past and didn't want to express them, even though I thought she should,
right?
I was like, who am I to tell her otherwise? You know?
No, I think you make a good point, in particular to the complexity of trauma. You know, if your parents were Holocaust survivors, they were carrying a legacy of trauma, and while we want to be able to heal trauma, I heard a definition: trauma is not only what happens to a person, but it's what happens to a person when they don't have the opportunity at the time to be able to talk about it. So I think the healing value is that it is important to talk about it. But as a therapist, I know it's really important to take people where they are. Because if I push people beyond their own comfort level, they're going to flee. So I maintain that, yeah, it is good to use the death word, the D word, and it is good to have these conversations, but it's also important to meet people where they are and not to try to impose something else upon them. So, you know, one of my friends, his father was a Western trained psychiatrist, and my friend was sort of a baby boomer who went off and studied Buddhism and studied the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he wanted to talk to his father about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and his father didn't want to talk about any of that stuff. I said, Elliot, you can't impose your Jewish Buddhist trip on your father. So the answer is yes, it's true. Your father's perspective was right, and your mother's perspective was right, and your perspective is right also. Is that helpful?
Okay. Thank you. No, it is helpful.
Rennie, please.
So I'm just wondering what your recommendation is when sometimes it feels like there's an internal inconsistency within Jewish practice. So my mother of blessed memory died right before Rosh Hashanah. So the funeral was the day before Rosh Hashanah. So when you talk about the mourning practices, you talk about Shiva that gets cut, and then Shloshim gets cut, and how do you guide people? We're supposed to have the joy of the holidays, but what happens to the grieving process on an emotional level?
Well, I think of it, and first of all, in its historical context, if it was a small community, you didn't want to be you didn't want to be disconnected from the community when they were doing Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or Sukkot. I mean, my grandmother was buried on the afternoon of Shmini Atzeret, and the family had a choice. You could sit Shiva for an hour and be done, or not start Shiva till after the Chag. And we chose to not start Shiva till after the Chag. So sometimes you could do that. And I say to people, look, you can still have a week of memorialization. If you're not living predominantly in a halachic universe, now I have to be careful. We got a conservative congregation and a reformed congregation, but sort of I hang out with renewal and reconstructionist Jews a lot, and they're not primarily in a halachic context where there's a chiyuv, where there's an obligation. So I see Judaism as a great database, and you can download and you can draw from the database. So if halachically it says you don't sit Shiva, that doesn't mean that you can't say we're doing a week of memorialization. We're not. It's Shiva, and I think we need to provide that. Somebody will say Shiva somebody will say Kaddish for a grandparent. There's no halachic guidelines to do that. Somebody will say it for a friend. If it works, we can draw from the database. Let's use it. Let's make our ritual practices of the 21st century need to contour more to people's emotional experience rather than to state-of-the-art Shulchan Aruch in 16th century Central Europe. Okay. Rini, you want to read this, Rabbi Altman?
Sure. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear on oath and said, I'm about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father. Then I will return." Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do."
Okay, so right, Jacob says, I don't want to be buried in New Jersey. I don't want to be buried in Florida. Send me back to New Jersey. So anybody want to comment on this here? So the 70 days of mourning were over, and then Joseph goes to Pharaoh and says, "My father made me swear an oath that I'm going to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. So let me go and bury my father." So Pharaoh says, "Go, you can do that." Anybody want to comment on that? You notice anything strange in that passage?
I'll comment here. This is Jamie, Jean and Judy's son. It almost like a modern workplace relationship where Joseph is going to his boss and has to get permission to follow his dad's orders.
Right. And what he does,
This is a
Yeah, go on.
family. This is a family matter. What
Yeah.
does Pharaoh have to? How does the boss have to sign off on this?
Well,
And this
first
is
of all,
Judy.
yeah.
This, Judy, against the background of the funereal practices of the Egyptians, which were so elaborate in trying to avoid death and prepare, to live in the afterlife. It's really an amazing story.
Well, guess what? He has to lie. He lies to Pharaoh. My father made me swear an oath. Let me go and bury my father in the tomb I dug for myself. Jacob did not dig a tomb for himself. Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah. Isaac was buried in there. Jacob inherited it. There was no way he didn't dig that out. If Joseph is going to go to Pharaoh and say, listen, excuse me, sir, I want to have my father buried in Canaan. And Pharaoh says, what are you talking about? We got the best burial system in the entire ancient Near East. What do you mean you want to go and bury your father in Canaan? He says, well, look, my father dug his own tomb there. Oh, your father dug his own tomb. Of course I'm going to let you go. But he didn't. Jacob didn't dig out his own tomb. So I didn't notice that for many years. But it's a very interesting little sort of sneaky piece that came in there. So so this is a very real life issue where people die in a certain location and want to be buried somewhere else. So they did the mourning. They did the mourning in Egypt, and then we're going to read in a second. They go up. They go up to Canaan, and they sit Shiva there for 7 days, which is where we get the tradition of 7 days of Shiva. And people do this. They'll do 3 days in their parents' community, and then they'll go home and do another 3 days in their own community. We have that much more. Joanne, what I thought we were supposed to be buried within a day. Well, yeah, but I guess when he was mummified and sometimes we think of our halachic practice as state of the art today, but it evolved over centuries. It evolved over, and they did try to do burial quickly in the ancient Near East because they didn't have refrigeration. Here's an interesting little. Okay, so Joanna, you can let's bring another voice in. You can read this. No.
Me?
Yeah, go.
Oh, okay.
Joanne.
So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and elders of the land of Egypt, and all of the house of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's house, with both chariots and a horseman. And it was a very great company. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father.
Okay, so that's where we get this. That's one place midrashically where we get 7 days of Shiva. But it's interesting. He has. Let me see if I have this quote coming in here. Oh yeah, now read this. Before you read it, what we just read is a replication of a traditional Egyptian mourning ritual. Let me go back and then forward. And it's a whole retinue of all the elders of the house and the children and the chariots and that, and then they do this whole big thing at the threshing floor of Atad. Now read this one.
The transport of the body to the tomb took the form of a ritual procession, normally beginning on the east bank of the Nile and crossing over on ferries to the cemeteries on the west. Close to the mummy stood 2 women impersonating the divine mourners, Isis and Nephias, then followed by groups of mourning women. As the bier neared the tomb, it was greeted by ritual dancers as a lector priestess read from a funerary papyrus in honor of the deceased.
So Jacob's retinue, his ritual of transporting him from Egypt up to Canaan, replicates the traditional Egyptian mourning ritual practices, and that sort of snuck its way into the Torah, but we have that, and it's so different from our contemporary images of death. We have a culture that's very uncomfortable. I mean, this is the classical scene of Jackie Kennedy and at the funeral of John Kennedy. Many of us grew up with that image, but the grief is much more complex. I'm going to read this next one. I wrote it as a contemporary midrash. It's 12 months later, after we just buried. The year is over. When we got back from burying Jacob in Canaan, it seemed like everyone in his family was doing okay. I had no idea how it would all unfold. It turns out Uncle Reuben has had marital problems. His wife complains constantly that he should get over his grief and be more attentive to her. And Uncle Benjamin has been depressed the past 6 months, ever since there were problems settling the estate with his brothers. And my cousin Levi's youngest daughter, we have not even seen her all year. She's angry at everyone because she couldn't have dancing at her wedding because her father was in mourning. What a family drama. So we sometimes see a situation right after the Shiva, and it looks like everybody's doing well, but 6 months later or 12 months later, the SH hits the fan, and it's much more complex. So the other thing that we take from this Jacob and Joseph story is to honor the grief rituals, but to know that there's much more complexity in dealing with grief. Like I said before, don't say to somebody, call me anytime you need me. Be in touch. We want to build communities that are caring communities. Let me get on my soapbox for a minute here, at the risk of whatever you'll hear, you'll know what my risk is. In a lot of communities, particularly Reform communities, everybody stands for Kaddish. When we used to be in community together. The problem I find with that is that mourners become invisible. If you're saying Kaddish, there's something very real about standing and being seen and saying Kaddish. When everybody stands, there's a problem with that. So in some of the Reconstructionist communities, they or even some Reform communities, actually, I go to Central Synagogue on cable TV on many a times, and they have people who are immediately saying mourning, please stand, people who are saying a yisker, people who want to support others, and then anyone else. So at least there's some way of doing that. The other thing is the mourners stand, and then at Yeheshme Rabbah, everybody else could stand up, or those who want to support them. But I think there's something about making grief visible that we want our communities to be able to do. Okay, I think there's one more, and then we're just about to come in for a landing here. Okay, let's share screen. Okay. Go, Miriam.
Okay. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into his bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people.
So in biblical language, death is being gathered to his people, or they say Solomon slept with his ancestors. It's in a rationalist universe, it's a nice metaphor, but with a little mystical awareness to know that being gathered to his people is entering the realm of the deceased ancestors. In biblical times, death is a return to the realm of the ancestors. Vayesaf el amav. While you are alive, you are a living being, a nefesh chaya. Right? Adam, and God breathes life into Adam, and he becomes a living being. When you're dead, you're nefesh met, a dead spirit. So while you're alive, you hang out with the family tomb, the family clan. There's the patriarch and the wives and the grandchildren and the camels and the goats and all of that sort of the Levi-Strauss called the participation mystique. And then when you're dead, you hang out in the family tomb. You hang out in the realm of the ancestors. So in biblical times, there is also a sense of an afterlife. It's not heaven versus hell or body versus spirit. It's while you're alive, you're with the family here, and then when you're dead, you're with the family in the family tomb. And they found in Israelite burial chambers, not Canaanite, but Israelite burial chambers, there were holes in them because they put in food stuff, like they gave them a little nosh for the journey. So there is this perception of an underworld, because it's underworld of the dead. So that's a longer conversation. We could do a whole thing on death in biblical tradition. But given the time, I think I'm ready to come in for a landing, and then we'll see if there's a few more questions. So the question that I want you to think about is this. Who do you imagine being there to greet you when you are gathered to the ancestors? Yeah, wait, I thought there was another quote that was supposed to come here, but I guess not. So death is simply a shedding of the physical body, like the butterfly shedding its cocoon. It's no different from taking off a suit of clothes when no longer needs. It's a transition to a higher state of consciousness where you continue to perceive, to understand, to laugh, and to be able to grow. So that is what I have to say for this morning about Jacob's legacy to us.
Yesher koach, thank you.
Yesher koach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I guess if you're going to see the ancestors when you get to the other side, then you can't ever drop off working on all that stuff you have to work on with them.
Well, there are some of the work they're doing around ancestral healing. There's the wounded dead, and then there's the benevolent dead. So some beings sort of clear up their karma a little bit more, and they can be guides for us. And with some of them, we're still working that stuff out. Yeah. So I mean, I tell my kids when hang on, I just want to write my INSTITUT. My website is now in the chat. If you want to reach me, I do counseling, I sell books and all that. I tell my kids, I want them to remember me as an inherently flawed man who tried to do better every single day. Because that's what tshuva is. But with my luck, they'll just remember the first part. So that's the work. That's the work. I don't teach about afterlife because I think I want to focus. I think afterlife is the best thing since sliced bread. Okay. Even if it's gluten-free sliced bread, I teach about afterlife because I think it gives us a sense of meaning and purpose in dealing with living a life of meaning here and a life of tshuva. And that's the Jewish way. That's what the Jewish way is. We focus on the life and the living because we want to live a life of meaning, a life of connection, a life of holiness. We want to do the tshuva, but there's still some sense of at some point there is a world beyond. So I hope I stimulated some of your conversations. The homework is to really have these conversations about end of life concerns with your families. Whether you have your funeral arrangements, whether you've written your ethical will, all of these pieces are really the take home, and to have them within your communities. What kind of resources do you have within your community when people are sitting Shiva and all of these things? So Mike Fessler, Rabbi Mike, thank you very much for the invitation. Rabbi Altman, Rabbi Miriam, Rabbi Polish, thank you all, and thank each of you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So
thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom, folks.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Okay.
Rabbi, is this going to continue this evening with the rabbi?
Not as far as
this
I know.
rabbi?
No, the
Oh,
first piece was last night. The first part of Reb Simcha's program was last night. This is part 2 today.
okay. I thought I saw something about 7:30 tonight.
No,
That was
7:30
last night.
This is part 2 of
You know
2.
what?
Okay.
Let me make another announcement. Michael, do you have the link for my wife's Nechama Minyan? My wife
I can find
does
it.
a minyan at 9 o'clock every night. Which started during Shiva, back, and your mother died New Year's Eve 2020. And we were just getting used to Zoom and Zoom Shiva and Zoom funerals. My mother-in-law had COVID, so my brother-in-laws weren't going to be with us. So she started a minyan. We did the Shiva was in the Zoom room of 500 people over the course of a week. She said, I'm going to do it throughout Shloshim. And then she continued doing it throughout the year. And then she says, she stopped saying Kaddish, but her mother's name was Nechama. So she calls it the Nechama Minyan. And every night at 9 o'clock, there's a minyan. If you can get that link and let your congregations know about that, it's open to anybody who needs to say Kaddish or needs healing prayers or just wants a Jewish fix at 9 o'clock at night.
Thank you. I would have it immediately accessible, but I can make it available later. Thank you.
Okay, Nidaber. Okay, good Shabbos, folks.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good Shabbos.
Rabbi Fessler, did he leave?
No, he's
Can you hang on for just 1
Yeah.
minute afterwards if everybody else can? Or maybe Rabbi Miriam too, just
okay.
something I want to share with you. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Thank you, Susan.
Shabbat shalom.
Yes,
Thank
Todah to
you.
Susan.
I was going to say thank you to all of the rabbis for helping out and making this
Cantors.
possible. It was really a great Shabbaton.
And our cantors.
Yes, and our cantors. I'll see you soon.
Everybody's not off. All right.
Could we say
Okay,
that
bye, Mom.
last night was recorded, and if anyone missed it, they could contact their rabbi and possibly get a link to that
Yes.
recording?
Yeah, now I'm going to stop the recording. All right,
Thank
most
you.
everybody's gone. Thank you, Shabbat